So, Memorial Day has come and gone, right? And all your gardens are in, right? How you prepared your soil, what varieties you planted, where you planted them, those decisions are done and over. Maybe. So anyway, I guessed. And I figured there's no point talking about what plants do well here, or where you should plant them, or how to pick varieties, because that's all done. So what I'm going to talk about I'm just going to go through and give you some tips about how to get the most from the garden you already have in. Did you know that commercial food production is responsible for almost 1/3 of our carbon footprint? It's due to millions of barrels of oil being used to move produce from food to market, to run machinery, to create fertilizers. Let me see if I can. Production of homegrown foods uses a small fraction of the same of the energy, produces a small fraction of the carbon footprint to produce the very same foods, especially if you grow organically and produce your own soil amendments. What I'm trying to say is, if you grow your own vegetables, you're making the world a better place. Thank you. So, how can we get more from what we've already planted? I don't have time to talk about everything you can do, or even to go into a lot of detail, but I'm going to talk about some of the easiest things to do, some of the most important things you can do. I'll talk about thinning, weeding, mulching, feeding your plants, knowing your insects, delaying maturity until your plants are big enough to support a good production, making sure flowers get pollinated, controlling the space that plants use, the benefits of pruning, using all your soil, that is, not letting garden space lay fallow, and not wasting nutritious food. Obviously, with all these topics, what I say about them is going to be pretty brief. My hope is that what I'm going to do is make you aware of some practices so that then you can pursue some of these things on your own. Because you know, most gardeners learn by trial and error, right? There's going to be time for questions afterwards, and you can ask me anything, even if it has nothing to do with what I've been talking about. Because I couldn't guess what your interests were. The other thing you should know is that I'm coming at this as an organic gardener, and that will explain some of the practices I do. So let's start with feeding plants. Your soil is already prepared, your plants are in, but there's still things you can do to get more nutrients to your plants, especially those heavy feeders. For example, you can spread compost around the base of plants. I always keep a bucket of water next to warm weather crops that use lots of nutrients. Whoopsie, let's see. Like squash, cucumbers, corn, even peppers or tomatoes. I put a big handful of compost or manure in the bucket and fill it with water. By the end of the day, the water's nice and warm, and lots of nutrients have dissolved in it. When you water the plants with that stuff, you can almost see them grow. Make sure the bucket is a dark color so that the sun will heat up the water, and put a top on it. Even when the weather's cloudy and cool, the water's going to warm up. Another good source of nutrients is mulch from nitrogen-rich vegetative matter, such as grass clippings. I'll talk about this later, but the vegetative matter that you use in mulch will release nutrients to the soil as it breaks down, and it'll be gradually feeding your plants. And remember, sunshine feeds your plants. Plants make their food, which is starches and sugars, from carbon dioxide and water. The process is called photosynthesis. And the energy used for the process is sun energy, light energy. So for many plants, the more sunlight they get, the more food they make, and the faster they grow, which makes Fairbanks, with their long summers, a great place to grow vegetables. So look for the sunniest location for your vegetables, except they're already in the ground. So there's nothing you can do about location now, but there is something else you can do to increase sunlight. Weed. Weeds will race to block out all sunlight from your vegetables. You've got to get rid of them. They want all the sun. They want to hog all the nutrients from your soil. And they're superb at outcompeting our domestic vegetables. You've got to keep the weeds out. We garden, therefore we weed. And those weeds are going to grow at precisely the rate at which you remove them. Whoever said work well done should never need doing over, never weeded a garden. It's constant work, unless you mulch. Mulching is one of the best ways to keep the weeds from growing. Of course, you have to first get the weeds out that are already there. But I can't overemphasize the benefits of mulching, especially if you use vegetation for your mulch, such as grass clippings. Not only will the mulch keep the sun away from the weeds so they can't grow as long as you put it on thick enough, and as I just said, it will also add nutrients to the plants as it gradually breaks down. And it will help maintain moisture in your soil. And it will keep your vegetables clean. So if you mulch your lettuce and herbs, you shouldn't have to wash them. And that's a real time saver. But don't use grass clippings if you use weed and feed. Also, watch out when you mulch that you don't burn your plants. Fresh grass clippings can get really hot because of their high level of nitrogen, especially when they're in a pile. I like to spread them out to dry while I'm mowing the next batch. Once they dry, they won't burn the plants you put them under. Be careful you don't mulch before the ground has warmed up enough for your plants. The mulch will insulate the soil from the sun, and the cold ground underneath will keep the soil above too cool for the plants. For some plants, that means waiting till July, but there are lots of plants that like cooler soil. So I start the season by mulching my peas with the first grass clippings. Then I move on to lettuce and spinach and other greens as the grass clippings become available, and cole crops, and finally root crops. And by then, I'm having to go back and put a second layer over things, and that pretty much uses all the grass clippings we get. Another benefit of mulching is that it can prevent your root crops from getting sunburned. For an extreme example, look at the top of these beets. Beets grow up as much as they grow down, so it's hard to keep mulch on these cylindrical beets. But heavy mulching will protect most root crops from sunburning. While I'm talking about mulching, I should talk about the need for constant moisture in your soil. There really aren't any vegetables you would grow that like to have their soil dried out. Nutrients that plants use from the soil must be dissolved in water, and that can't happen if there isn't water in the soil. So mulching is a great way to keep moisture in the soil. And when I say moisture, I don't mean swimming. Plants need oxygen as well as water. You don't want to drown them. However, mulching can only go so far. Most summers have dry periods, except this summer maybe, when we need water. For this, I don't think you can beat irrigation tape. The tapes get water directly to the plants and nowhere else. Especially if you have to haul water or you pay a water bill, irrigation tape pays for itself. If you have a water collection system, such as collecting rainwater from your roof, the water will have time to warm up as it sits in the containers, and this is much nicer on your plants than our 35-degree well water. You'll need a location of the water containers so that they're high enough above your plants that the pressure will push the water through the tapes. If you don't live in the hills, you might put them on the roof of your house. Whoopsie. That's a little system. Anyway, put your system in, put it on a timer, and go fishing. Remember that I said you have to get rid of weeds to get good yields? Well, just as important as that is thinning. Yes, you have to do it. If you start early, it'll be the easiest. And the earlier you get your crops thinned, the better they'll get a start and the bigger they'll get. 1 carrot is worth lots of little unthinned ones. Vegetables like beets can be thinned to half space first, then you can thin them to full space as they get bigger. That way you get to eat the thinnings early in the season. Here's another important thing. Get to know the critters in your garden. These are root maggot larvae. Some of them are pests, some of them eat pests. That's a rove beetle. Some of them do a lot of damage, some not so much. And of course we have bigger ones like voles and moose. I haven't taken photos of these. We're lucky in Fairbanks in that we have very few of the insect pests found in the lower 48. But there are some. And unless you want to eat a bunch of pesticides, the best approach is to accept that a healthy garden has lots of critters and to gain an understanding of the life cycles of these insects. For example, aphids are part of our natural environment in Fairbanks. When they're prolific on the aspen trees, they'll be prolific in your garden. But then, right behind them, by a couple of weeks, we'll also have lots of ladybugs. And ladybugs like to feed on aphids. So accept the fact that we're going to have aphids. Keep your plants healthy so they won't be weakened by them. Where the aphids can cause damage, like on peppers, usually it happens before you transplant them into your garden. You can immerse them in a bucket of water until the insects float off, or turn them upside down, or use a hose to shoot a strong flow of water to knock them off the plant. If you can be patient, the ladybugs and their larvae will take over. If your lettuce looks healthy, don't worry about the aphids. Wash the lettuce off with water before you eat it, or don't wear your glasses when you eat it, and the extra protein will be good for you. Root maggots are another one. Understanding their life cycle is crucial to controlling them because it's the flies you need to protect from, because they're the things that lay the eggs that get into your roots and eat them up. The best protection from them is netting. I'm not going to go into them now, nor the cutworms. Take my class and I'll tell you all about them. But the point is you need to understand the life cycle of these insects to be able to deal with them. You probably know that for most plants, the biggest plants support the biggest fruit. This means, say, for zucchini plants, you want to remove those first early squash when they're really small, as thick as your finger, even before their flowers open. They're really tender then, so you can put them in your salads. Those young zucchini plants often produce more fruits than they can support. By cutting the fruit off early, you're giving the plant a chance to grow bigger to where it can support bigger fruit and give you a bigger production. When you do this, you'll get bigger fruit sooner. Another good example is broccoli. You want to delay heading until the plant is as big as possible. Stress from lack of water as well as from heat will work against you, speeding up the maturity of the plant with the production of a head. And that will happen before the plant's big enough. So keep the soil moist. Again, irrigation tapes really help. Mulch is very effective at keeping the moisture in the soil, and also it helps to keep the temperature down. You don't want to mulch until the temperature of the soil is about 60 degrees. Usually I start mulching cold crops in mid to late June. Use a soil thermometer. Sometimes plants have trouble pollinating. Some people tell me they don't have any bees around, which is too bad because our local bumblebees are great pollinators. Do you know bumblebees are 10 times better pollinators than honeybees? Or you may be growing your plants in a greenhouse where they don't have bees and they don't have wind. Or your corn may be all in a row and the pollen gets blown directly away from the row. Whatever the reason, ensuring that your plants get pollinated is necessary for maximum production. Some plants, like tomatoes, for them it's just as simple as vibrating or shaking them once or twice a day. For others, like zucchinis, you can hand pollinate them. Just take the male flower with once it has pollen on it and pull the petals back, take them off, rub the male flower over the stigma of the female flower, leaving pollen on it. And voila, you'll be getting zucchinis. And for corn, you can bend the tassels down near the ears and shake the pollen so that it falls on the silks. Sometimes you might want to carry a little wind block with you to prevent the wind from blowing the pollen where you don't want it. We don't often think about pruning our vegetables, but a number of vegetables benefit from this. A great example is broccoli. Although some varieties are bred to have a big center head and then they're done without even producing side shoots, most good varieties put out some nice big side shoots after the center head is harvested. The trick to getting all you can from broccoli is to keep it well watered, growing in rich soil, and never letting the shoots flower. After you harvest the first 2 or 4 side shoots that are good sized, the next side shoots get smaller and really aren't worth much. But now is not the time to give up on your plants. They're not done. Prune them. Knock off all the side shoots so that none of them can flower, because that will stop production. Then start removing leaves from the bottom up. Do it gradually. I remove the ones first that are in my way, that are growing out into the paths. Then I start removing leaves that are shading other plants. The leaves will break off easily where they're attached to the stem. Don't take the leaves out of the garden. Lay them on the ground under the plants. They make a good mulch. They'll help retain moisture, and as they decompose, they feed more nutrients to the plants that are working to produce a second crop. After about 3 weeks of the leaves laying on the ground, I'll look underneath. The bottom layer is pretty much decomposed and the worms are just going crazy. By the end of August, all the leaves are off. Now, that's based on my timetable of getting my plants in by mid-May. and usually I'm harvesting the center heads by mid-July. So by mid-August, when I've taken all the leaves off, the broccoli patch looks a mess and the plants are just stumps. But I'm getting great production of suckers that grow. They grow off the lower part of the stems or out of the ground off of the roots. Here's a sucker growing off of a stem. By mid-September, I have a whole new crop of heads. They're not quite as big as the original center heads, but they're as large or larger than the biggest side shoots. Then we have the problem of the rambling giant vegetables that want to take over your whole garden. Although pruning can solve some of these problems, some plants don't benefit from that solution. For example, potatoes in winter, squash will take over a huge portion of your garden, and you don't want to be pruning them, at least not radically. Because their vines keep growing and they sprawl all over the ground, a good solution is to move the vines to the area you want them to be. If hopefully you've planted your winter squash at the edge of your garden, you can train the vines to go out of the garden to wherever you want them. Whenever a vine grows in the wrong space, you just move it to where you want it. And if it's usually heavy enough, it'll stay there. If it's not, you just put a weight on it and hold it there. Pretty soon, the plants will start becoming pretty obedient and get the gist of it. Potato vines, on the other hand, can be pretty brittle. They do better if you fence them in. Something like chicken wire that will hold the vines back. When the vines start to go up and over the fence, just push them back on top of themselves. Other vines, like tomatoes, depending on the variety, benefit from both pruning and tying up. Keep up with it, and don't wait until the plants are a mess to deal with. Finally, don't let any of your garden space sit empty. You've harvested a bunch of lettuce and have the space free. Plant more lettuce, or spinach, or turnips. Turnips planted in early July are absolutely delicious come August or September, and they don't mind frost and snow. Spring planted spinach is not going to stand. You need to harvest it as soon as it shows signs of flowering. Eat it or freeze it and plant another batch. Here you can see, some planted in August next to some that was planted in July. Or plant some every few weeks. Greens like pak choi or other Asian greens grow fast. You can plant some in mid-July and be enjoying them all September. In fact, plan on a fall garden. Many vegetables have no problem with frost or snow. Some, like kale, get a lot sweeter as the weather gets colder. Even broccoli leaves can become delicious at that time of year. Some years you can extend your season all the way through October. Any crops, like lettuce or spinach, that you plant for the fall should be planted deep into the soil. Then mulch them well so their roots will go a long time without freezing. By now the ground is warm, so use that warmth to keep your roots warm. Most of these plants don't mind if their leaves freeze. You just don't want to freeze their roots. Even here, we were still eating lettuce out of that plastic-covered place. So get creative, and you can keep things going a while. Finally, don't throw your vegetable scraps into the compost pile before you extract a good broth from them. Almost all scraps you throw away have more nutrition, except for the greens or the green parts of potatoes, peppers and tomatoes, they'll have more nutrition in the part you toss out than in what you preserve or eat. So cook all those pea pods, celery leaves, onion skins, etc. in some water, and then sieve out the solids, squeeze the liquid out of them, and you have a delicious soup broth you can use right away, or you can freeze it and can it for later use. You'll find it tastes better and is better for you than any canned broth you can buy in the store. I hope some of these tips are helpful. I hope you get bumper crops of everything, and most of all, I hope you have a lot of fun. Do you have any questions? Any? Yes?
How do you get spinach so it doesn't bolt?
You won't get spinach so it doesn't bolt. Spinach comes from the Middle East, and it's a plant that grew to go to seed in the spring and summer, and then start growing in the fall. And we try to do exactly the opposite. And they try to breed spinach varieties so that they won't bolt, but you can only go so far with breeding. It goes totally against the genetic makeup of the plant. So what you have to do is plant your spinach. The minute it starts to flower, if you remove all stress from it, keep the soil nice and moist so that it'll grow fast, you'll get great production, and then quick harvest it as it starts to flower. And you've got a couple days to do that, and freeze it, give it away, eat it, and plant some more. So plant your spinach successively. In the fall, it seems that spinach in decreasing daylight lasts a lot longer. It can even flower and still put out good-sized leaves. In the fall, where it can't do that, once it flowers, its leaf production just gets crummy. So in the fall, you can let it go and keep harvesting it. So, yes?
I plant peppers, I have them in the greenhouse, and I never get a very big yield. As the plant stays small, and I get maybe 2 peppers per plant. Do I need to pollinate?
Well, it's possible you need to pollinate. Do I need the, oh, I'm sorry, thank you. Yeah, so she wondered about peppers. They don't grow very well. She doesn't get a very good yield, and she's wondering if she needs to pollinate. And certainly in a greenhouse, you might need to pollinate. You don't have any wind in the greenhouse, and you probably don't have any bees.
What's the method? Is it shaking like you do with
The easiest way to pollinate peppers is to just take your finger, maybe moisten it, and stick it inside each blossom and move it around, and you'll move the pollen onto the stigma, from the stamens to the stigma, just doing that. You can take a little paintbrush or a Q-tip, but your finger works fine. And just do that in all the blossoms. And the other thing is you want to make sure that the pepper plants are getting enough nutrients to get big and strong so that they'll produce a good crop. You should be able to, if you get your peppers started in time, you should be able to get 2 crops of peppers. A first crop that's sort of staggered and nice, but not that big. And then around the 1st of August, they really start coming in strong with the second crop. You want to keep the peppers. If you wait for them to get red and sweet and delicious, or whatever color they're supposed to get when they're mature, then they tend not to produce as many. The more you pick, the more you get. So I usually keep them picked early in the season, and then starting August, I let them go once I get that big crop and let them mature. Yes?
I had trouble with voles last year.
Keep a trap line going. So every piles of little mouse traps all over. Peanut butter and jelly is good. one of the popular traps is to take what used to be big, they don't make big coffee cans anymore, but a big smooth container, it could be plastic or metal, and bury it in the ground with just the very edge of it just slightly above ground. And then fill it with water to about an inch of the top. And voles just love to climb in that and drown themselves. And yeah, you got to keep at it and pray for owls. And we've had a couple of really bad vole years. I'll tell you a trick that we grow barley, and I have found that it seems when we've had bad voles, they tend to sit in the barley and leave the root crops alone for the most part. So I've been thinking, I wonder if you just put a bunch of barley around the edge of your garden or someplace besides near the root crops, if that would just keep the voles busy. Yes?
In the past, I got some scabs on my potatoes. I've read that you can use molasses to get rid of the scabs. Is that true?
Well, so scab is indigenous to our soils. It's Streptomyces scabies, and it's throughout the soil, and it thrives in organic matter and all the best conditions for growing vegetables. So one of the ways that's been popular for controlling scab has been to make the conditions for growing scab poor, which means conditions for growing vegetables are poor. You keep the pH of the soil real low. The scab does not do well in soil pHs that are below 5.5, which is 5.5 is the natural silt pH of a lot of our ground. Don't put organic matter in. Well, what happens when you do that is you don't get a very good potato harvest either, because the potato plants use a lot of nutrients. So what they found in recent years is that scabies do well in dry conditions. And if you keep your potatoes well watered, other bacteria thrive, and they tend to outcompete the scabies. So one of the first rules of growing potatoes is not to let them go dry. Keep that soil moist. And then if you do have, and rotate, try to use clean potatoes that don't have scabs on them when you plant, and rotate to clean ground. It's good to follow potatoes with cole crops. Cole crops seem to be very detrimental to the scabies. Grains are pretty good to follow potatoes with. And then if you do have scab on your potatoes and you really want to knock it, you can take a cup of blackstrap molasses as the formula and add that to put that in a 5-gallon bucket and fill it with water. Let it sit for a day in the sun with the top on, stir it periodically, and then water that onto your potatoes, trying to get it right down onto where your new tubers are growing. That can get pretty expensive if you have a lot of potatoes, because blackstrap molasses is not cheap. When I do that, I'll substitute a bunch of sugar for the blackstrap molasses, because what happens is the bacteria, other bacteria, just explode on all those sugars, and they totally wipe out the scabies, outcompete the scabies. And then after a while, that great initial bloom dies back, and you get back to where you were before, and the scabies bacteria then starts to multiply, and you do it again. So maybe do it 2 weeks later. And if you do that 3 or 4 times in a season, after you think your tubers have started growing, you'll pretty well get rid of the scab. So follow those conditions. Keep your potatoes moist all the time. Give them a molasses feed now and then if you want to. And use clean potatoes. Rotate your crops so that you're not planting them in soil that already has a lot of scab in it. Yeah?
Also, I've heard removing all the flowers when they start coming on.
No, I don't. That's a lot of work. You could theoretically, it should give it more energy to go to seed. At least it'll keep you from having potato weeds all over your garden, which you tend to get when you let the potato flowers ripen and turn into little potato tomatoes, right? But it takes a lot of time. If you just grow a few potatoes, sure, do it.
I thought I read somewhere where if you remove them, you get bigger potatoes, maybe?
Well, I don't remove them, and I get huge potatoes. Theoretically, that should work. I don't think you have to bother. I think your potatoes will get plenty big enough. What happens if you follow these rules about keeping enough moisture in your potatoes and rotating, trying to get rid of the scab in other ways than depriving the soil of nutrients, is the potato plants are going to just thrive and they're going to give you huge production. Yes?
I have found a way to double tomato production
Uh-huh.
by tripling the root ball.
Tripling the root ball. Okay.
If you go to a nursery in mid-May and now, the tomatoes will be approximately 25, 30 inches tall. Typically, they will tell you to plant a tomato 2/3 of its stem, which of course you're not going to plant that tomato like that. Instead, plant it only about 10, 12 inches below soil. On a 45-degree angle, angle the trough, take all of the stems off, leave only the very top of the head. It doesn't look very good because it's horizontal to the ground. In the morning, it's up. And the roots grow off of the entire stem. And this keeps the entire root ball close to the surface so that you're nourishing it and watering it. And
Yeah, that does nicely.
I harvested last year a whole lot of 1.5 pounds tomatoes off of a early girl bush, which was all fruit and no vine.
Nice. Yes.
When you plant your tomatoes, do you have certain things you like to add to the soil organically, like eggshells and fish heads?
Anything you can get in there that's full of nutrients. Manure is great, compost is great. So it also depends on the kind of tomatoes you're growing, where you're growing them. If I'm doing indoor tomatoes, and I'm really pushing them for production, I have to watch out for blossom end rot. Outdoor tomatoes, the kind I grow, are just so productive. I mean, just put lots of manure in the soil or compost, and they'll thrive. And it's true, laying them down to get more of the stem to be root. I tend to do that earlier in the season. I start my tomatoes early. I start them in February. And then I'll transplant them into bigger pots pretty deep so that all that stem turns into root. And then when I put them outside, I'll put them at about soil level. But yeah, tomatoes use a lot of nutrients. Interestingly enough, they probably use more calcium and more potassium especially in the early production stages, than they do nitrogen. Well, wait a minute. Yeah, someone had a question there, yes?
Blossom end rot is a result of not enough water to the plant. The plant struggles, takes the fruit of water out of the fruit in order to survive. That is the source of blossom end rot. I never have it if I literally water the plant.
Well, you're right. Water is usually the culprit because what blossom end rot really is a lack of calcium getting to the ends of the fruit. And that causes cell walls to collapse. And then the cells leak fluid and you get all this, bacteria starts to grow in it. And usually our plants are not getting enough calcium because they're not getting enough water to carry the calcium to all parts of the plant. Another cause, thing that it really accentuates that are our long days. Our long days really make it easy to get blossom end rot in greenhouse tomatoes. Okay. Yes?
Lots of questions. I've seen all winter I saved my eggshells. And I planted that in with my tomatoes that I've started to plant. What is a good source of magnesium organic?
Epsom salts.
Okay.
Magnesium sulfate.
What quantity?
Well, it depends what. I don't know. Do you have a lot of compost in your soil? Are you using fertilizer?
Yeah, organic, the kind that they use up at the plant.
So if you have balanced nutrients going to your plant, you probably don't need Epsom salts. If you're trying to, if you're using rainwater that doesn't have any minerals in it, and you're doing it almost like hydroponic gardening, then you need to be clear on all the minerals you're adding. But yeah, tomatoes certainly use a fair amount of magnesium, almost as much magnesium as calcium. But a lot of that you get in your, depending on what the minerals are in your well water. And I think city water is fairly high in calcium and magnesium, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, yes?
I have two questions. One, do you believe in rototilling in your garden? I've heard lots of people say that you should never rototill. And then the second one, you talked about compost. What do you put into the material you're making your compost from that stimulates the composting action?
So I keep forgetting, Althea, to repeat the questions. I'm sorry. So the first question was, do I believe in rototilling? And the second question is, what do I put into the compost to get the compost to heat up and compost, to get the bacteria to start doing their thing? So the first question is, do I believe in rototilling? Yes, in Fairbanks, because if you don't grow in really high raised beds, if you just grow in the ground, our ground is very cold. And rototilling really does tend to warm the soil up a lot faster and get organic matter, compost, manure, whatever you're putting in, mixed in. So I know that in the lower 48, it's discouraged if you can just let I think it depends what part of the country you're living in too. I think in your most northern parts of the country, you still probably do need to rototill. People who have really high raised beds, Linden stachocus is one. don't rototill, and they don't need to. Their soil warms up really fast, and organic matter then decomposes in that soil pretty quickly. But when your soil is cold, the organic matter is not decomposing and breaking down, and rototilling is beneficial. And the insects and worms just recover just fine. I haven't found a problem with that. Two, what was the next question?
Composting.
Compost. The best thing to add to your compost pile, if it's mostly garbage and greenery from your, I mean, to get it going, you need nitrogen-rich stuff, right? So fresh grass clippings will really heat it up. Anything fresh greenery will heat it up. If you know somebody who has animals and you can clean out their barn for them, that will really get it going. So you need, nitrogen-rich sources to get it going. Okay? Yes. Wait. Let's give this guy a chance.
Okay. In the Andes, for the last 10 or 20 years, they started using high rows a lot. This was like this could be that.
High rows.
Well, I'm sorry, I believe that.
High tunnels.
No, not high tunnels. This is
Raised beds.
Raised beds, big time. But this is that leaves a chocolate papa, which is a hand plow. So it's tough to do, but they found out that makes a big
Does.
Have you ever? Does anybody ever use an air spade for aerating you know what an air spade is?
I do not.
Well, you should probably look it up, because what it does is I used them up north, and they use them to dig where you can't dig with a jackhammer. And if you point it to the ground and it's not, right now, it's loose, a foot deep.
Huh.
And I thought it might be a good way of aerating around. I'm not a aerator. And also, you can introduce things with a Venturian. Also, have you ever heard of Yacon, Y-A-C-O-N?
Yeah.
And I wonder why people don't grow that here. One, it's sweet, but the diabetics love it in, say, Peru, because you can eat all you want and your body doesn't process that sugar. It's like
Inulin is what's in it. Inulin is the sugar that's in it, and it is very good for diabetics.
And also, it looks like a cross between a yucca and a sweet potato, and because of what you said, I didn't realize, if you were to intersperse, I'm guessing wrong, perhaps, if you intersperse that with the potatoes, it would help the potatoes by getting rid of the skin. And also, if you a plant that you can eat raw, and it's got a sweetener in it that doesn't affect diabetics, there's probably some sort of market for that, I think.
So I was under the impression that Yacon takes too long a season to grow for us.
But if you introduce them early, like you do some of your plants,
You mean started inside ahead? Yeah,
or high tunnels or whatever.
maybe if we had high tunnels. I don't know enough about it. Okay, yes?
How do you feel about the food dirt that you can get from the utility place? Do you ever?
About what?
How do you feel about using it?
About using,
The food dirt that the utility gives away?
oh, the sewage okay. How do I feel about the sewage plant compost? It's great stuff. Stuff grows wonderfully from it. The only problem is there are a lot of things that are water soluble that aren't able to be removed. And medications are some. Certain, chemicals that are flushed down drains. And so I'm reluctant to put that on my garden because we get all our food from our garden. So that's the problem with it. You don't know exactly what's in it.
And I wondered whether they get the medication out.
A lot of your medications are water soluble. Yeah. Yes.
Can you advise what best when you go shopping, let's say vegetables, the cabbage family? I go looking for the least mature. My neighbor buys them about 10 inches tall and never gets a decent crop because the cabbage head is already in that small little plant, and they never produce a satisfactory.
So he's wondering what to look for at a nursery when you go and buy cabbage.
Or vegetables in general.
So first I'll tell you what I do. I don't buy cabbages from nurseries because I'm looking for cabbages that will store through the winter in a root cellar. And that's a particular variety of cabbage called a storage cabbage. And I have not found nurseries selling storage cabbages. They sell what are called summer cabbages that will mature in the summer, and you better use them at the time they mature. Now, if I were going to be buying cabbages from summer cabbages from a nursery, I would not want to ever buy any kind of cole crop that was already producing a head. Because it will, as you're saying, be stunted if it's in a little bit of, if it's not in the ground yet. Okay? Yes?
What variety of storage cabbage do you like?
Well, the variety I used to depend on called Danish ballhead, which was an open pollinated variety that's very old and stored wonderfully, has degraded, and that's a whole story about global seed companies, and I'm not going to get into that now, but I'm going back and have been trying some other ones. The best ones I've had recently have come out of Stokes. One called Bartolo is an old standboy. Johnny's has one called Johnny's number 5, and that's a good one. The old Danish ballhead used to store right up into July. It was wonderful in a root cellar. And most of these, Bartolo and Johnny's number 5, usually you can get into April, May. So those are pretty good. We had one last year from Stokes called, let's see, what was that called? It began with an E. Not Expect. Yeah, that seemed to do pretty well. Okay, yes. What? Okay, what, you had a question?
Terry, you have a cold cellar. I don't. I've never figured out how to keep carrots. What do you recommend I try? I usually have a big crop of carrots, and by October, November, they pretty much start drying out in the fridge.
So the question is how to keep carrots if you don't have a root cellar. And number 1, you have to keep them cold. Number 2, you want high humidity. So as close to freezing as possible without freezing, so 35 degrees would be really nice, and 90% humidity will keep your carrots really nicely. So you might be able to store them in an extra refrigerator, in plastic, especially for an old refrigerator that doesn't have automatic defrost, which tends to dry everything out. I recommend if you've got like a garage, some cold place, maybe under the house, wherever it is, that you can find that if you'd wall it off, maybe with some insulation in a corner of that basement, and just put plastic over the top, you might be able to create a humid environment that's pretty cold. Better keep it under 40. So somehow you have to come up with an environment that is cold and humid.
What vegetables do you raise that winter over, like chives, rhubarb, will come up the following year?
Well, right now we have asparagus coming up, rhubarb, chives, Welsh onions. Used to have tarragon. I don't mess with anything. Oh, and then of course garlic you plant in the fall and comes up in the spring. That's all I can think of. What? Oh, horseradish, there's one. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's all I can think of. Yes?
I just bought a horseradish root from.
Good.
Hospice, what's this one? Where?
Watch out, it's invasive. So it will pop up, it's very hardy. It'll pop up all over the place. So find a place that isn't inside the garden that you want to normally plant in. And yeah, it'll do fine.
Any particular type of soil I should put in there?
Well, it loves regular garden soil, but it's pretty tough. It probably won't do very well in just plain silty 5.5 pH soil. You want to have closer to garden soil if you can, but it's tough and hardy.
Is it some good compost then?
Yeah, yes.
Can you do garlic now?
Can you grow garlic now for this season? Yes, you can. It will not do as well. It depends what kind.
It's German porcelain.
Yeah, so your German, the hardneck garlic, which is what you're talking about, likes to have a cold period to cause its bulb to divide into cloves. And so at this point, you're not going to get that. So if you would grow some of the soft neck garlic, like California type garlic, you can probably do okay. Get moving fast. Yes.
Something is eating the leaves of my rhubarb. Every year, trails all through it, big brown. It doesn't affect the rhubarb itself, but the leaves are awful. And I've never seen anything. I think it might be a caterpillar, but I'm not sure. You know?
Boy, it's a caterpillar who doesn't mind oxalic acid, because those leaves are full of oxalic acid.
And it's never visible during the day, so it must be doing its work at night. But my leaves look good right now, but it's usually as it goes along, they'll just look.
So does it just decimate it by the end of the season?
Well, no, it stops midway through.
And then the rhubarb probably recovers just fine.
It doesn't affect the stems and the stalks at all. It's just the leaves.
I don't know what that is. I can't imagine who would like to eat rhubarb leaves. But my guess is the rhubarb still thrives. Yes,
Can you put rhubarb leaves in compost?
sure you can. I use rhubarb leaves to mulch the rhubarb. But yeah, they'll compost fine. Okay.
Last question.
Yes,
Are you or anybody you know trying to use biochar?
biochar. No, we use wood ashes for a fertilizer, which always has a certain amount of char in it. And I find that works just fine. And I wouldn't bother to do the biochar, but yeah, that's pretty popular. He wondered what, if I was doing biochar, which is a process of smoldering, burning wood very slowly in the ground. And then you get this sort of charcoal type of result that has a lot of nutrients for your plants, but it's the same minerals in there that you have in your wood ashes. It's just available faster in your wood ashes. So it's all the same stuff.
Well, let
Yeah.
us give her a round.
Thank you.